Hi everyone, I'm Rincey and this is Rincey Reads, and today I'm finally going to be doing my favorite books of the year video. So this is something that I wanted to put out earlier, but I was having a hard time putting together this list this year. So my reading in 2021, I went through a bit of a reading slump and I just wasn't quite as excited about books as I usually am. I don't know if I just wasn't picking up the right books or if it was my mood. I feel like it was just a combination of some of those things. And so I went through a bit of a reading slump. Usually my method for putting together this list is on Goodreads. I have a shelf marked as favorites, and so whenever I finish a book, I will occasionally put that book on my favorite shelf. And then at the end of the year, I will go through all the books that I put on that shelf and write them out and figure out which ones of those are my favorite favorites, because usually I'm pretty generous. Not pretty generous, but I do feel like I put a decent amount of books on my favorite shelf because if I really enjoyed a book, I consider it my favorite. But is it a favorite I want to highlight in a video? Usually not always. Usually about half of those books end up on the actual videos that I make here. However, this year was a year that was not like others. And so I only had 15 books on my list this year, and I was going back and forth about what I wanted to do. Did I just want to do a top 10 maybe, or I even thought about doing a top 5. There are 2 books that I've marked as 5-star, or no, 3 books actually, technically on Goodreads, that I marked as 5-star reads, and so I was like, I could just do a top 3, but that's pretty boring. But I was having a hard time sort of sifting through the other ones to figure out which ones I thought were better than the others. And then I finally came to the conclusion, I don't need to do any of that. I will just do a top 15, because doing 15 books for a favorites list is not that hard, or it's not that uncommon. Some people do top 20s. So my usual disclaimers before I start the video are that these are all books that I read in 2021. These are not necessarily books that were published in 2021. I also don't rank my books. I will point out the books that got 5-star ratings for me, but outside of that, I am really bad at ranking my books because it just comes down to minute details sometimes about the difference of one book versus another. So I'm going to go through this list in chronological order of when I read them. And so with that said, let's jump into the books. The first book I have is Midnight in Chernobyl by Adam Higginbotham. The subtitle to this is The Unknown Story of the World's Greatest Nuclear Disaster. I don't think I really need to talk about this book too much because I feel like this book in and of itself is pretty popular, especially since this book was part of the basis of the HBO series Chernobyl that was extremely popular, but this is a nonfiction book that is all about the Chernobyl disaster. The thing about this book that really surprised me is just how incredibly gripping it is for being a nonfiction book that is so extremely researched and detailed. Do I remember every single detail that Adam Higginbotham talks about in this book? No. If you picked a random name in here, will I remember who that person is? Not necessarily, because there are a lot of people that are mentioned in here, and that is something that people could potentially get bogged down by. But if you're willing to not necessarily work on committing to memory every single detail in here and just appreciate the overview and the breadth and depth of the coverage of this book, you get a really, really good sense of what exactly happened in the lead up to the Chernobyl disaster that caused it, as well as how it was handled and mishandled in the days afterwards. And I just think that even if you're someone who doesn't read a lot of nonfiction, especially history nonfiction, I feel like Adam Higginbotham does a really good job of really pulling you into this really gripping story. Again, there are a lot of details in here, but I still feel like this book is really, really well done for the scope and the breadth that he covers. Next up, I have Conjure Women by Afia Atakora. This is a historical fiction book, and this is one of those books on my list where I know it's a book that's not going to be for everyone, but I really enjoyed my experience reading this book. This book takes place in the United States in the South, and it takes place right around the time of the Civil War. And you are mainly following these 3 characters. One is a slave woman named Miss Maybelle, who is kind of a healer on the plantation. You follow her daughter Rue, and then you follow the plantation master's daughter, Verena. And so Rue and Verena are basically right around the same age. So you follow the 2 of them as they kind of spend time together as they grow up and come to age, and sort of the changes that happen because of the effects of the Civil War. This book does jump around in time a little bit, so you see Rue as a older woman and sort of where she eventually ends up, and then you get to see sort of like how things on the plantation went to get her to where she is. There's a little bit of mystery in here, but I will say that this is a book that is definitely more character focused than plot focused. To some people, this plot may seem meandering, but I honestly found the characters in this book to be so extremely compelling. They are extremely morally gray characters, and so there's a lot of like decisions in here made by characters that I'm like, oh, that's not a good idea, or that's not a good choice. But I just found them all to be so compelling. I just remember reading this book and being so enraptured and wanting to know what was going to happen next. I did find some of the things about the ending to be a little bit like disappointing because it felt too neat, especially with the rest of the story and the fact that the rest of the story could be a little bit messy and a little bit morally gray. But otherwise, like, this was a really intriguing book for me. And I don't think it's going to be for everyone, but I really enjoyed my experience with it. Next up, I have The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans. This is a collection of short stories. And this book will forever probably hold a special place in my heart because it was a book that helped me get out of my reading slump, or started me on the path out of my reading slump, because I read Conjure Women in February and then this book came around in April, and I remember just in that like month and a half, 2 months in between those two books, just not fully enjoying what I was reading. And so I honestly thought I was like couldn't find anything to read. I felt very like, oh my gosh, I'm never gonna find another book that I love again. But this book in particular made me realize that what I needed to read at the time was short story collections. The stories follow all of these different characters who are going through these extremely complicated times. Like, this is a short story collection that feels very much in the here and now, but I feel like the stories deal with more universal issues that it will last for longer. The writing itself is extremely sharp. All of the characters that you follow in these stories are fully formed, and you are just getting like sort of these glimpses into their lives. The very last story in the collection, which I believe is the title story, is a little bit longer. It is more like novella length, so you do get a little bit more depth and meat in that one. And if I'm being completely honest, it felt a little weird to be reading a story that long after just a collection of stories. But I did find all of the stories to be really compelling in and of themselves, and to be following these characters who I would say like you don't really see very often in story collections, in my opinion. So yeah, I definitely think that this is a really fantastic collection for anyone who enjoys short story collections, but also even if you don't enjoy short story collections, I feel like this is really great contemporary literary fiction. And speaking of fantastic short story collections, I have my first 5-star book of the year, and that was The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by Disha Philyaw. This book and these stories are perfect in my opinion. This is one of like 2 short story collections where I can honestly say that every single story was perfect to me. This collection of short stories is relatively short. I think it has around like 6 or 7 stories in it total. And I feel like this is one of those collections where every story is the perfect length. She does an amazing job of providing you with enough information about a character that you feel emotionally invested in what's happening in the story. The stories don't go on for too long, but they also don't cut off too short. Like, it feels like each story in this collection was like perfectly written and edited. It's like none of these stories probably would work as a full-length novel. Like, these are perfect as they are as short stories. You're following all of these different Black women who all have some sort of connection to a church, whether they've grown up in the church or they consider themselves a part of a church or something along those lines. And they all have some sort of secret. So whether it's about a relationship that they have, or one of them's following a daughter whose mother is having an affair with a pastor at their church. You know, some of them are queer. They all live these complex, vibrant lives. And all of these stories just feel, they're perfect. There's no other word for this collection other than, to me, it felt absolutely perfect. It feels so incredibly rare that a short story collection be just like perfect on its own. Doesn't feel like there's too much or too little. but this book does it incredibly well. And very weirdly, after I finished that book and rated it 5 stars, I read another book that I immediately rated 5 stars, and that for me is The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. So I've been a fan of the Vlogbrothers channel and John Green for a number of years now. I've read all of his books, and I really enjoy his writing, but this book is the best that he's written so far. This is nonfiction, and it's a collection of essays, and it's really hard to talk about what this book is about. What John Green basically is doing is that he takes different things in the world and he rates them on a 5-star scale, but that isn't actually what's happening in this book. He talks about a variety of things like Canadian geese and sunsets and this very specific tree, and he talks about them to both talk about humanity at large and like these general thoughts and observations, but he also uses them sometimes to tell stories about his own life and his own experiences. And so it's this like interesting combination of essay collection, observational writing, memoir, all of these different sort of genres of nonfiction, and it's so well put together. This book was written relatively recently, and so he even talks about things like COVID and going through this pandemic and quarantining and things like that, the lack of hope, and then the experience of hope of getting a vaccine. And I listened to this book on audiobook, and so I feel like it provided me a way and words to express sort of like what I was feeling going through the pandemic and going through quarantining and all of those different things. Again, I watched Vlogbrothers, and so I've seen a lot of John Green's content, and so like having him narrate the audio book felt very familiar to me as well. And so there was something that was very like comforting about this book and reading this book this year that I don't think I could have experienced it anywhere else. So yeah, to me this book is perfect, and I've been recommending this book to a lot of people over the past couple of months because I think it really does a good job of commenting on sort of like the sadness of life, but also providing hope and light through all of it. So yeah, 5 out of 5 stars, one of my favorite books of the year. All right, next up I have Black Sun by Rebecca Rowan Horse. This is a book that genuinely took me by surprise. I had heard a lot of people saying really, really good things about this book, and so I was like, you know what, I'll give it a try, and it blew me away because it like completely sucked me in, and it has a lot of elements that I generally don't like multiple perspectives, but like I was all in on this book. Like I said, this is a fantasy book that is based on pre-Columbian Americas, and you are following 3 different characters, and there is sort of this countdown that is basically happening to this specific event. And so all of these 3 different characters have like different either missions or things they're trying to accomplish, and they're all kind of like centering in on this one place on this one day. And the structure of this book to have that countdown provides this increasing tension as you are moving forward. And I will say like the one downside I suppose to this book is like when you get to those final chapters, it feels like everything moves very quickly. I also was not sure if I wanted to read this book right away because I hate like start reading one book in a series and then having to either wait forever for the next books to come out or for it to like get worse as the series continues. But this is one of those fantasy books where it is technically the first book in the series, but it actually kind of works really well as a standalone. Like, yes, there are still some questions that are left unanswered at the end of the book, but like if I never read book 2, I honestly would be fine. I am going to read book 2 just to be clear, but yeah, I really, really enjoyed this book. And I think that if you're someone who doesn't read a lot of fantasy, I think you would still like this book because there are obviously fantastical elements in here, but they're very light. Like this is very much a low fantasy book, which is something that I personally prefer. And I think the characters in here are fantastic. And again, like that timeline provides this increasing sense of tension, and you just like don't know what's going to happen when you get to 0 and it's not going to be what you expect. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed my experience reading this book, and I'm really looking forward to picking up the second book in this series. All right, next up I have Hana Khan Carries On by Uzma Jalaluddin. So this is the author of Aisha at Last, which is a Pride and Prejudice retelling that I thoroughly love. Like it one of my all-time favorite Pride and Prejudice retellings that's out there. And so this one is basically like a retelling or reimagining of You've Got Mail. You are following this young woman named Hana whose family owns this halal restaurant in Toronto. And so she works there part-time, but her dream is to actually get on the radio and to tell stories. And so she interns part-time and she works at the family restaurant part-time. But things start to occur when this new halal restaurant comes into town, and it's like this big corporate fancy restaurant. And so part of it is about sort of like the gentrification of this neighborhood, but part of it is also about this relationship that she is forming with the son of the owner of that restaurant. But also part of it is about like her life and her career and small coming of age story and things like that. This book is so cute. Super underrated in my opinion. I think that this book would be really good if you enjoyed the X Talk. I mean, maybe my head just makes those parallels because like there are characters in there that have to do with like public radio and things like that. But I think that there is also kind of like this tension and animosity between the love interests in the story that is kind of similar to what is happening in the X Talk as well. It's a really fun, sweet story, and yeah, it was really well done in my opinion, and I really enjoyed my experience reading this, and I'm looking forward to more books by this author because so far I've enjoyed everything I've read by her. So yeah, pick up this one, pick up Aisha at Last. Both of them are really great fun retellings. Alright, next up I have Hench by Natalie Zena Walschautz, and this is one of those books where I haven't stopped thinking about it since I finished reading it. So in this story, you are following this character named Anna, who basically works as like a temp or an office worker for a henchman. She basically gets like a job assignment where she has to go accomplish something, and she ends up having a run-in with a superhero. The encounter goes very poorly for Anna. Like if you think of like the way superhero movies go, there are all of these sort of like casualties and all of this injuries and damages that happen outside of like this main fight between the hero and the villain. And Anna is basically one of those people who's really damaged after the encounter with the superhero. And so that encounter ends up basically changing Anna's trajectory in her life and her viewpoints and all of this stuff. Like previously she looked at her temp job as just like a temp job, like she needs a job, they're hiring, so she's just doing the work. But then after this encounter, she basically turns course and wants to get revenge on the hero. This story is really well done. It's basically like a villain origin story because you're following Anna from this point where she doesn't like think really positively or negatively about any of the heroes, and you see how she ends up hating this one specific hero so much and how she ends up turning and the choices that she makes. It's like just this amazing character journey. It goes through so many ups and downs. There are so many points in this book where I thought like this would be a really good ending, but then something happens and it continues on. Honestly, like this book should be made into a TV show. It's a really character driven story. There are points where it's really witty and there's some really interesting commentary on the real world that we live in, and it ends in this like perfect way where it feels like full as a novel in and of itself, but it leaves the door just open enough that there could potentially be a sequel. And so if for some reason the author is watching this video, just know that I would be here for a sequel to this book. So yeah, if you're someone who likes those types of stories, I think that this is definitely one worth picking up. The next book I have on my list is The Other Black Girl by Zakiya Dahlia Harris, and I feel like this is a book that I don't need to talk too much about because it got a pretty decent amount of like hype and advertising, not even just on BookTube, but even outside of BookTube. The pitch for this book that I think is a really good pitch is this is basically like Get Out meets The Devil Wears Prada. You are following this 26-year-old woman named Nella who works as an editorial assistant at this like major publishing house. She's the only Black woman who is working there, and so she deals with a lot of like microaggressions and often feels really alone in her experiences. And so she gets really excited when another Black girl gets hired. This other girl's name is Hazel. She's from Harlem, and she's like a very different type of woman. Like Hazel has like natural hair and she's very into Black culture and all of these different things. A lot of people at the office really love Hazel. And so fast forward through the details, basically one day Nella is working at the office she's been going through some issues and things like that at work, and she gets a note that says leave Wagner now, and she's not sure like who left this note. She feels like it has something to do with Hazel, but she's not really sure how to prove it or anything like that, and she starts to investigate what exactly is happening here, who left this note, why someone would want her to leave her job. And so this is, in my opinion, a really well done like psychological story where you're not really sure like whether or not you could trust Nella as a narrator. Is she letting the stress of her job get to her? Is she just really insecure about herself and her position compared to Hazel? Is she just jealous because Hazel is getting more attention than she is? All of this other stuff. And there's just this like really interesting dynamic that is built between these two characters. I honestly had like no idea where this book was going to go. And so it completely like kept me on my toes the entire time. It felt like a true like page turner. I could see some people being disappointed in the way things go towards the end of the book, but honestly, like I found the reveals to be really clever, especially considering the comps and things like that. And there is a little bit of the book that feels a little bit open-ended and a little bit gray at the end of it, which I really appreciate and enjoy. But I enjoyed that sort of like slow burn building of tension over the course of this book, which again, I know is not going to be for everyone, but I really enjoyed it. So yeah, definitely one of my favorite books that I read this year. Next, I have The Five Wounds by Kristen Valdez-Quade. So this is a book that is 100% like a slow-moving, character-focused family drama book. It takes place in New Mexico, and you are following a couple of different characters who are all part of the same family. There's Amadeo, who is a 33-year-old man who isn't like super successful with his life. Like he has a drinking problem, and he has a hard time holding down jobs and things like that. And so he gets really excited when he ends up getting the part of Jesus during this like Passion Week procession. So he's like really focused on doing this well because he feels like if he does this well, his like mom will be really proud of him and he can brag about this to other people in his life and stuff like that. Like he really wants to prepare for this role extremely well. And I think it is like Good Friday or maybe like a day or two before Good Friday, his I think 15 or 16-year-old daughter shows up on his doorstep. And it turns out that she is pregnant. The daughter's name is Angel, and she's been living with her mom. And so she ended up getting pregnant, and her mom end up getting into a fight. And so Angel tells the mom to like drop her off at the dad's house, which is actually the grandmother's house. And she ends up staying there, even though the dad and daughter like rarely talk to each other. But she's decided that like she wants to take control over her life, and so she decides that she's going to move out of her mom's house and do things the way that she wants in regards to the birth and taking care of the child and stuff like that. And so these are the main two characters that you're following through this story, but you also get to see a little bit about Amadeo's mother, Yolanda. You get to see a little bit about Marissa, who is Angel's mom. And you see this like really complicated family dynamic and these really complicated characters who are trying really hard to do the right thing. The thing about this book is that like they're all trying really hard, but they're all struggling with stuff too. So even though oftentimes they're trying to do the right thing, you see them go basically like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back constantly. And it's frustrating and it's heartbreaking and it's a reality of the world that we live in. And you see that these people like want better for themselves and for each other and things like that, and that they truly love each other, but it's complicated. Like people are complicated, relationships are complicated. It's a really like slow paced, character driven story, but I found it to be like wonderful and heartbreaking, and I really wanted to know what was going to happen to all of them. And they don't get like happily ever afters, but you see them make progress as people, which in and of itself is huge. So yeah, I really enjoyed my experience with this book. Again, not for everyone because it is a slow moving story, but I think if you enjoy character driven family stories, this is definitely a book for you. Next up, I have Red at the Bone by Jacqueline Woodson. This is a relatively small novella, but the amount of like character development and reveals that happen in such a short span of time, I think really speaks a lot to Jacqueline Woodson's skills as a writer. So the story starts in 2001 and you are following this character named Melody who is celebrating her 16th birthday. And so she's having a birthday party at her grandparents' brownstone in, I think, Harlem. And so this is sort of like the central event, and then you get to see like these flashbacks from her mom, her dad, and her grandparents that have led up to this point in Melody's life. So you basically are getting kind of like a family history leading up to this point now, and then you see sort of like some stuff that happens after her 16th birthday. I feel like this book is like really unique, and it's really difficult to talk about without like giving too much away. I love the way that she revealed information about the characters through other people's perspectives, and you see sort of like the choice one character makes, and then you make flashback and see sort of things in the family history that led up to that point, and you see sort of all of these puzzle pieces go together, and it shows how people are not just formed by like their lifetime, but they're also formed by their families and the lifetimes that came before them. And I feel like this encapsulates that idea of like family history and the choices of the people before us getting us to the point that we're at now. There's kind of like this underpinning of like not nostalgia, but like kind of sadness, like this poignant look over the choices that were made in the past, the hopes and dreams of the grandparents for their kids, and the changes that they were forced to make and things like that. Just again, for like a really short book, it accomplishes a whole lot. And so yeah, I really, really enjoyed this book. I think a lot of people really love this book, and I'm really glad that I finally read it. All right, next up I have Velvet Was the Night by Silvia Moreno Garcia. I feel like at this point Silvia Moreno Garcia is one of those authors that everyone on BookTube has heard about, but she's also one of those authors who writes across a variety of genres. And so her books to me feel pretty hit or miss in terms of like whether or not I as a reader will love them, but I do try to read all of them because when she hits for me, she hits, and this for me was a hit. This book takes place in 1970s Mexico, and one of the characters that you are following is this young woman named Mate, who is a secretary. She's not really happy with her life. She doesn't really get along well with her mom or her sister. She's living on her own, which is looked down upon. She doesn't really like her job, anything along those lines. One of the things that she does for extra money is she'll like animal sit or pet sit for her neighbors when they go out of town. And so one of her neighbors asks Mate to look after her cat for the weekend while she goes away. Mate agrees, but then the neighbor doesn't return when she says she's going to, and suddenly Mate gets a phone call from the neighbor saying like something has happened, can you bring my cat and all of this stuff to this specific location? And so she agrees because she still needs to get paid, but then the neighbor isn't at that location either, and so she's now gone missing. And so Mate starts looking for her, partially because again she needs the money, but partially she starts to get like really wrapped up in this mystery of what is happening to this neighbor and why she's missing and why she's so difficult to get a hold of. The other storyline that you are following in this book is this guy who calls himself Elvis, who's basically like a gangster or hitman, and he's been hired by his boss or told by his boss to also find this neighbor. And so you see sort of like these two storylines converge as they are trying to find this missing neighbor, and you're also just trying to figure out like what is going on in this situation. This book hits a lot of things that I personally just really love. I love like these sort of 70s noir stories. I love mysteries. You're following two really complicated characters who don't really fit into the standards of society at that time. Yeah, I found this book to just be really fun and really compelling. Again, I don't think it's for everyone, and I don't think that necessarily if you are a fan of Silvia Moreno Garcia that you will necessarily like this one, but I really love this one a whole lot. Okay, next up I have The Stationery Shop by Marjan Kamali, and this was probably one of the most emotional reading experiences that I had with a book this year. This is one of those books that I had on my list for a really long time because I always thought the cover was really beautiful. And then I finally picked it up, and I'm so glad that I did. You follow these two characters named Roya and Bahman. You mainly follow things from Roya's point of view, who is this young girl growing up in 1950s Tehran. She really loves this one stationery shop in her town that is run by Mr. Fakhri. And while she's there one day, she ends up meeting this young boy named Bahman, and the two of them fall in love. And then something happens, and you fast forward in time and you see Roya as an adult not being with Bahman, and you know that like something happened on this day when they were supposed to meet each other, and you're not really sure what. And so you're following basically this past timeline and this present timeline with Roya as an adult, and then you follow this past timeline of her as a child. And you see basically like these two characters falling in love and dealing with these turbulent times in Tehran. And then you fast forward and you see sort of what's happening to Roya, and she's like a grown woman married to another man living in the United States. And so you go back and forth between these two timelines and you start to see the pieces come together. And so there's sort of this like mystery through this book of like what exactly happened to separate these two characters. Will they ever meet again? Because it seems like they're going to. What is it going to be like? Because Roya's married and all of this stuff and has her own kids and stuff like that. And so you get to see these two timelines, but there's also like other like beautiful and heartbreaking things that happen over the course of this book to Roya. It's just like so moving. I think it's been optioned to be made into like a movie or a TV show, which it definitely deserves to be, because like the story is beautiful and great, and I think the structure of it is really well done because it keeps you gripped, because you're following these two different timelines and you're just so intrigued as a reader to see how it's gonna come together as one complete story. It definitely does a lot of things that I was not expecting at all. The reveals in here are really, really well done. Yeah, it's really beautiful and heartbreaking, and I think that if you want just like a sweet love story that's not like a typical romance or like categorized as a romance novel or anything like that, this is a really good one to pick up. All right, and the final two books are two books that I read last month for Nonfiction November, so yay for that. The first one that I have is The Undocumented Americans by Carla Cornejo Villavicencio. This is a book that, again, I feel like was all over BookTube, and I'm so glad that I finally picked it up myself. It's a relatively short nonfiction book, and the author was part of DACA, and so when things were happening in 2016 where there was a lot of conversations about immigrants, especially immigrants from Mexico, Central America, and South America, she decided that she wanted to work on telling the story that she feels like doesn't really get told a lot in regards to these immigrants. Like, the stories that we seem to hear are either about really, really terrible things happening to immigrants, or sort of like these extraordinary immigrants who are like defying the odds and stuff like that. And she's like, this is not what the average life is like from what she's seen. And so she talks about the experiences of being an undocumented person in the United States, but she uses like different things as sort of like the linchpin of each chapter. She talks about how a lot of undocumented peoples were hired as workers to work on the wreckage after 9/11. She talks about the difficulties that they have to deal with in terms of healthcare and medicine because they're undocumented. And she talks about all of these different topics and uses them as a way to talk about what the experience is like as an undocumented person in the United States and how difficult the experience is for the average person. And she doesn't like detach herself from the story at all. Like, she very much involves her own personal story, her family story, and she talks about her experiences like directly with this stuff. Everything about this book was just so well done. It's so compelling, and I appreciated sort of like all of the different lights that she shines, because a lot of this information was definitely new to me, and I don't think would be new to most people who picked up this book. So yeah, highly recommend picking up this book. I don't think that there's anyone out there who would not enjoy it, honestly, whether you read nonfiction or not. And then the final book on my list is White Tears, Brown Scars, How White Feminism Betrays Women of Color by Ruby Hamad. This is another book that I would rate like 4.5 stars, but I rated it at 5 stars on Goodreads because I thought it was so well done. As a person who reads a decent amount of books about feminism and racism and things along those lines, this book tackles intersectionality in a really great way. The subtitle basically tells you what you're getting in this book. It talks about how white people and white women specifically have ignored or hurt other women in working towards a specific type of feminism or trying to push forward a specific type of feminism. One of the things I really enjoyed about this book is the fact that it covers a lot of different types of experiences. So she talks about the experiences of Asian women. She talks about the experiences of women who do not live in the United States. She hits on some topics that are things that I feel like I knew about, but then the farther I got into the book, the more I felt like she was getting deeper and deeper into the story, or deeper and deeper into the history of white feminism and the effects of it. She basically like continues to provide evidence and build this case of how focusing on a specific narrow type of feminism basically hurts all other women. And so we need to work on sort of detaching white supremacy from feminism in order to create a feminism that is truly inclusive. I think that this is a really great book if you are someone who has been interested in learning more about feminism and racism. This covers that intersectionality really well, and it feels almost like the next level or the next step in sort of like learning about anti-racism and stuff like that. And yeah, I feel like it's really well done, and I want to hand these to people who have picked up books like Bad Feminist by Roxane Gay and want to like keep going in those sorts of ideas and lines of thought. So that's it. Those are my favorite books that I read in 2021. Let me know down in the comments below if you read any of these books, what your experiences were with them, whether they were your favorites or not. Or feel free to leave a comment down below letting me know maybe a couple of your favorite books that you read this year. I love hearing people talk about their favorite books, and so I would love to hear what books topped your list this year. So yeah, that's all I have for now, and thanks for watching.